Chapter 13 of Fact Stranger Than Fiction by John Patterson Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dundee, Aberdeen, Huntley, Glasgow. It was with a feeling akin to awe that I entered the ancient city of Dundee, Scotland, for I had often heard a dear old hymn called Old Dundee, sung in my childhood, and besides a few years previous to my visit, I'd read in far-away America of the total collapse of a long railway bridge which spanned the Firth of Tay, when a train which was crossing it disappeared from sight, and not one of its human freight was left to tell the sad, sad story. James Thompson, Esquire, LL.B., solicitor and notary public, a real Scotsman, a right good fellow in the fullest acceptation of the term, and as humanitarian and patriotic as any man who walks God's green earth, met me at the station and escorted me to his handsome residence, carrying my satchel in his hand a part of the time. I was quite fortunate, and deemed myself highly honoured in meeting Mrs. Thompson, the talented and versatile wife of Mr. Thompson, and the mother of two beautiful children, James and a sister. The day following my arrival, Mrs. Thompson suggested that we take a stroll through the business portion of the city, in the centre of which I afterwards learned, by the way, her husband owned extensive holdings, so that she could point out to me the principal objects of interest, including the museum and art gallery. I suspect my enthusiasm was not in evidence to the extent that she anticipated, whereupon she exclaimed, "Senator Green, I'm afraid you do not appreciate my invitation." Of course, I assured her in most positive terms that the contrary was true, and we sallied forth on what proved to be one of the most enjoyable urban rambles of my whole life. Here is an aside for my American readers. The social manners of Europe, and especially Scotland, were so at variance with what I had been accustomed to in my native land, that frequently I hesitated for a moment until I could make sure that I was not obtruding myself in any respect, for social intercourse is so absolutely predicated upon congeniality, that to push or shove one's self into a circle where he is not wanted is, to my mind, not only in bad taste, but reprehensible. I found Dundee to be a large, populous, and wealthy city, with substantial ornamental buildings for business purposes as well as for residential uses. The home of my guests, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, was no exception to the rule, and while being entertained therein, I felt that all my efforts during my lifetime to rise above the sad condition in which the failure and death of our dear deceased father had plunged us had been crowned with success, and that the kindly attentions of my wealthy and refined entertainers was the culmination of a full fruition in that behalf. In referring to my memorandum book, which I carried with me at that time, 27 years ago, I find this memorandum: James Thompson, Esquire, LL.B., solicitor, etc., and his good wife of No. 1 Hindford Terrace are of the elite of Dundee, and are elegantly domiciled in an imposing stone mansion, which contains all the modern improvements and many of the luxuries which wealth can afford. Mrs. Thompson is an earnest, conscientious Christian lady, the mother of two children, a boy and a girl. The former, named for his father, is about 3 years of age, while the latter is 9 months only. James is quite fleshy and handsome, but at present is cabined and cribbed, compelled to keep off his feet until his bones harden a little more. Everything that broad minds, big hearts, great souls, and good breeding can suggest is being done for me by these kind people. I can never repay them. I may mention here that my meeting in the evening was a marked success, since it was presided over by the provost of the city, and had the matchless services of Mrs. Margaret M.A. Steele, of Shanghai Victoria Place, West Ferry, Dundee, in its behalf, who went so far as to distribute dodgers advertising the meeting in the streets of the city. Further comment would seem unnecessary. James Thompson, Jr., grew up to man's estate and was generously educated, having a diploma from one of the leading universities of Scotland. His specialty was journalism, in which sphere of action he was making commendable progress, as well as in that of public speaking, and he bid fair to honor not only his profession, but his family and country also. Then came that howling tempest, the so-called World War. Sonorous, metal-blowing martial sounds, at which the universal host up sent a shout that tore hell's concave and beyond, frightened the reign of chaos and old night. Paradise Lost, line 540. O dark, 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 amid the blaze of noon, irrevocably dark, total eclipse, without all hope of day. Samson Agonistes, line 80. This brave, talented son of Britain went to war for true democracy. He gave all he had, after being commissioned for bravery, his life. He did his bit. At this late date it can be said of my dear good friend Mr. Thompson and his family. Mrs. Thompson and the family are all attending university classes. The eldest boy, second son at Glasgow, is studying for the ministry. The other two children are studying at the University College at Dundee, all busily engaged in making life worth living. Long life and abundant prosperity to them all is my prayer. Perhaps I should mention the fact that a few rods from the location of the piers on which rested the long bridge, which formerly spanned the Firth of Tay, is another, more modern and stronger. Down to this writing it has withstood all the storms and hurricanes which have assailed it, nor have they been able to prevail against it. The au revoirs having been said, again I am en route, this time for the Granite City, Aberdeen, well up towards the north of Scotland. It was a delightful ride, that through that picturesque Highland country with its firs covered slopes and beloved thistles, for which the land is so noted, and there were in evidence as we flew along the uncanny but comfortable crofters' lodges, with the ben in one end and the butt in the other, the inmates of which can live anywhere else in the world as well as in Scotland, for with the payment of $5 per annum for an acre of land, which must be stoned, just as peaches or cherries are stoned, before a crop of turnips or oats can be produced on it, if they can procure the necessities of life, to say nothing of the comforts and luxuries, they can live and thrive anywhere. The turnip crop ensures abundance of food for the fine sheep to nibble at, which foretells a good crop of wool for the world-reputed Scotch tweeds and other valuable cloths, guaranteed to be all wool and a yard wide. Then, too, I am informed that occasionally the turnip is not to be despised as an article of food for the table, when properly cooked, and the marmalade factories, which give remunerative employment to hosts of pretty lassies in Aberdeen and elsewhere, claim a goodly portion of them. As for the oats, who that knows Scotland can be at a loss as to the use made of them? I know of but one other staple food in the world that is served as food in as many different ways as oats are in this happy, contented land. I refer to the macaroni of the Italians, for I've eaten and seen this delicious dish, not only served as stews and fries and what not on the table, but also wrapped in gilded and decorated paper and exposed for sale as a delicacy on the shelves and counters of the confectioner. Ere long the train, which had lost no time, drew into the depot, and the pleasing call of Aberdeen saluted our ears. In waiting and expectant was Dr. George Ferdinands, an oculist by profession, and friend and adviser to the late Mrs. Isabella Fyvie Mayo, who during her lifetime, under the nom de plume of Edward Garrett, gave to the reading world a series of about 35 volumes of stories. At the home of Mrs. Mayo, whose guest I was, a hearty welcome was extended to me, and a great good cheer was my portion, while my hostess did in every consistent way what she could to make my Aberdonian visit a success. It is to Dr. Ferdinands my gratitude is principally due for many hours of his precious time consecrated to my happiness and benefit. Introductions to the late John Leith, Esquire, a heavy manufacturer of Scotland tweeds and other clothes, and who, by the way, out of his abundance financed my trip to Aberdeen, and promoted the successful meetings which I addressed while in that beautifully quaint city. I say quaint, yes, for not only were the warehouses and dwellings built of granite, closely resembling our Quincy granite, but even the outhouses for the use of the cattle and poultry were constructed of the same, which gave to the city not only the appearance of solidity, but of thrift, both of which were in accordance with fact. Then there were Reverend Mr. Mackay, prominent in church in every helpful endeavor, and Reverend Mr. Duncan, an elderly yet very eloquent speaker. Reverend Mr. Mackay, in the course of his remarks at the drawing-room which was given in my honor at the home of Mr. John Leith, where there were many invited guests, said that he had been informed that in the East, when a white woman marries a native or black man, she is socially tabooed and pricked with bodkins by her white sisters, sent into Coventry, so to speak. This occasioned apparently considerable surprise, considering that the Orientals are so thoroughly mixed with the African blood, and so many representatives of the race are still to be found in the harems of the sultans and others, in both Turkey and Arabia. But not one word reflecting on the colored race was uttered. Mrs. Mayo proved herself to be quite a story-teller, which, by the way, I noticed to be one of the pleasing characteristics of the Scotch people wherever I went. Here is one which I regard as being full of humour, as well as suggestive of the rugged life of the remote Highlander. A guest travelling in the Highlands was suddenly taken seriously ill, and requested the services of a physician, whereupon she was informed that the nearest doctor resided at a distance of 17 miles. "Why, how inconvenient and dangerous that is," she answered. "What do you do in an emergency when one's life is imperilled?" "Well," the maid replied, "we just have ter dee a natural death." Another of Mrs. Mayo's stories, which I subsequently found in Dean Ramsay's book of Scotch stories, is in substance as follows. A Scottish lad experienced so much embarrassment in popping the question that he took his sweetheart to the family lot in the ancient cemetery, and while standing with her by the graves of his ancestors, he significantly said, "Jenny, how wad ye like ter have the richter lie there?" Also, the following story seems quaint and full of quiet humour. A young man went with his intended to the minister for the purpose of getting married, but once there he refused to permit the knot to be tied, because, he said, he had taken a scunner to his intended. Subsequently they went again to the parson for the same purpose, but no nuptials were celebrated, for the reason that she had taken a scunner to the man. A third time they appeared before the man of God, but the marriage failed because he himself had taken a scunner to both of them. Before leaving Aberdeen, Mr. John Leith invited me to speak on Sunday at the P.S.A., Pleasant Sunday afternoon, of which he was the superintendent, and to a great extent the soul. This was one of the most pleasing functions of my entire visit to Aberdeen, for not only large numbers of children and sweet-faced youths were in attendance, filling the big auditorium to repletion, but also there was sweet music rendered, both vocal and instrumental, which carried one's mind heavenward. I heard for the first time the musical rendition of Tennyson's beautiful verses beginning "Twilight and Evening Star" by a quartet of which Mr. Leith's talented and useful daughter was one. Her deep, rich, and resonant contralto was the chief feature of the rendition, and I can never forget it. I am loath to conclude this brief notice of Mr. Leith and his family without recording a beautiful legend of the Christ, which he related with telling effect. This legend is said to have been found amongst some ancient documents in the year 1903. It happened that the Lord went forth and walked with his disciples over the mountains. They came to a mountain, and the road which led to it was steep. There they found a man with a sumpter mule, that is, a mule which carries necessaries for a journey. But the animal had fallen, for the burden was too heavy, and he beat it so that it bled. And Jesus came to him and said, "Man, why dost thou beat thy animal? Seest thou not that it is too weak for its burden? And knowest thou not that it suffers pain? What is that to you? I can beat it as much as I please, seeing that I own it, and I bought it for a good sum of money. Do you not notice how it bleeds? And hear you not how it laments and cries?" Replied Jesus. "Nay, Lord," was the answer, "we hear not how it laments and cries." And the Lord was sad, and exclaimed, "Woe to you that ye hear not how it complains to the Creator in heaven, and cries for mercy. But 3 times woe to him of whom it complains and cries in distress." And he came forth and touched the animal, and it rose, and its wounds were healed. And Jesus said to the man, "Now go on and beat it no more, that you also may find mercy." However, my appointment for Huntley, far north in Scotland, demanded my departure, and ere long, with my dear new-made friend, Mr. Dr. George Ferdinands, by my side, we were en route to that ancient home of the Gordons, noted in history, story, and song for deeds commendable and the reverse. To attempt to recall any of the deeds of the Earls and Lords of Gordon would be tiresome to the reader, and reference must be made by the reader to Hume, Macaulay, Froude, Lingard, Green, or Dickens' Histories of England for full information. Enough to say that old Gordon Castle, imposing and strong, is still standing in the suburbs of Huntley, which probably had its origin from the presence of the castle and its titled inmates dating from the year 1603. In Huntley we were the guests of Reverend and Mrs. Templeton, who were both of the social elite, educated and respected. My lecture was delivered in the kirk, over which Mr. Templeton presided, with dignity and satisfaction. The attendance was large, and the spirit of liberty manifested was in keeping with the well-known Scotch character. Amongst those present of especial note were Mr. William Simpson and his good wife. Mr. Simpson was the proprietor of the bookstore of the town, which seemed to be well stocked with modern and rare books. A typical Scotsman, really it is worth the price of the trip to the Highlands, if only to meet with representatives of this brave, picturesque people. I can never forget my first night spent in Edinburgh, when I saw and heard in the market-place, almost under the shadow of the Scott Monument, a numerous band, or should I say clan, of bagpipers. This certainly was an experience which ought to have made the canonized bones of Sir Walter Scott, hearsed in death, burst their cerements for joy. For the like of it I never expect to hear again. On the day following my lecture in Huntley, Dr. Ferdinands, chaperoned by Miss Annie Bennet, a pretty and lovable Scottish lassie, conducted me to the ruins of Gordon Castle, which, as regards the exterior, cannot be called ruins. As to the interior, the walls were cold and bare, no light, no fire. Cold on the hearth, the last faint spark had expired. Dean Ramsay tells a humorous and suggestive story which carries us back to the last Duke of Gordon, and proves that conditions in the old castle were never comfortable in accordance with our modern civilized idea. David Tulloch, tenant in Drumbennan, under the second and third Dukes of Gordon, had been out in the 45 or the 15th, or both, and was a great favourite of his respective landlords. One day David, having attended the young lady Susan Gordon, afterwards Duchess of Manchester, to the chapel at Huntley, David, perceiving that her ladyship had neither hassock or carpet to protect her garments from the earthen floor, respectfully spread his plaid for the young lady to kneel upon, and the service proceeded. But when the prayer for the king and royal family was commenced, David unceremoniously drew, or rather twitched, the plaid from under the knees of the astonished lady, exclaiming, "The Dio, a one shall pray for them on my plaid." Down by the foundation of the castle dashes and splashes a clear rippling brook, spanned by a stone arch, over which we passed to the other side. Suddenly I missed the doctor's lively companion, but only for a moment, for quicker than I can write this story she appeared again, bearing in her hands a bunch of pretty wild flowers, which were growing almost on the edge of the crystal stream. With all the grace of another Hebe of classic fame, she presented them to this writer as a token of the good wishes of herself and the friends for the cause which I, in some sense, represented. For many years I kept them, and it may be that to this day they are tucked in one of my packages, souvenirs of that eventful trip. But time and tide wait for no man. We had to leave. I felt sure that the doctor was counting the minutes, I the hours. On the day following our return to Aberdeen, I bade a fond and loving adieu to the good friends who had added so much of pleasure to my life, and turned my face in the direction of that great hive of industry, Glasgow, where the wonderful steel leviathans are built, which plough the seas in all sections and climes of the habitable globe. En route, a repetition of mountain and vale and lake and rippling stream and nibbling flocks and herds were in evidence, and old Benacci, a veritable storm king, reared his snow-capped head to kiss the clouds, and much more of this. Finally, after hours of diversion, the tallest spires, then the highest buildings, and after that the dwelling-houses of the great city could be discerned, and behold, we were in the midst of the great city on the river Clyde. At the station, and waiting to receive me, was Mr. William G. Schmiel, of Monteith Row, a gentleman of culture and large means, who had as his business the wholesale importation of teas. Mr. Smeel and his interesting family were elegantly domiciled, and in other respects gave evidence of being one of the foremost social factors of Glasgow. Mrs. Smeel was somewhat deaf, and expressed some fear that I would be unable to speak loud enough for her to hear me at the meeting which was scheduled for the following evening. I am pleased to record here that after the meeting she exclaimed with every appearance of pleasure, "Mr. Green, I heard every word you said." My pleasure was reciprocal, for they both exerted themselves to make my stay in the city pleasant and instructive. Mr. Smeel was thoroughly imbued with the anti-slavery spirit, and from his conversations he was a man who had drunk deep at the same fountain where our immortal Jefferson had quenched his thirst for the principles of liberty and manhood rights. Later on, after my return to the United States, he mailed to me a little book, ancient in appearance, which contained the report of the House of Commons on the African slave trade. It is the only one I have ever seen, and since it was published in the latter part of the 18th century, I suspect it is rarely met with. During the following day, Mr. Smeel dedicated most of his valuable time to showing me the vast plants for the building of ocean ships and their furnishings, which I viewed with a degree of astonishment akin to awe, and afterwards he escorted me to the ancient cathedral, and conducting me to the basement or crypt, he pointed out the identical pillar behind which, tradition informs us, Rob Roy, Sir Walter Scott's interesting border highwayman, concealed himself when he found that discretion was the better part of valour. In passing through the humble parts of Glasgow, the inordinate use of spirituous liquors was easily apparent. Even the women who in some sections thronged the back streets showed unmistakable signs of intoxication. These women in many instances carried babies on their back, secured by the close-drawn folds of their shawls. It was a sorry spectacle which made a lasting impression on my mind, which the lapse of 27 years has not obliterated. Some of the little ones who toddled by the side of their neglectful mothers presented a spectacle which was by no means reassuring, for in numerous instances they were malformed by the rickets or some other sign of physical degeneracy. After a pleasant visit of some 48 hours, I turned my face once more in the direction of Liverpool, where I duly arrived, and without the loss of much time returned to the great metropolis, London, the capital of the great British Empire, the greatest empire of which we have heard or read, upon the whole of which the sun never sets, great in territory, great in population, wonderful in resources and wealth, which rules on sea as well as on land, and whose fall it is ever ordained to be will overwhelm many more than those now under the aegis of her government. End of chapter 13.